But yeah, don't accidentally put rubbing alcohol in your eyes. It does not go well for you. You'll be fine. You're just gonna like be very uncomfortable for the rest of the day. Now, getting a metal filing in your eye, that's another story. That might fuck you up.
The original PlayStation only has 2 megabytes of RAM.
That's a lot of megabytes.
Just 2. And yet somehow it was able to run games like Resident Evil.
Yeah, it's almost like developers back then made games for the hardware. Oh, speaking of not making games for the hardware, did you know the GTA 6 isn't going to run at 60 FPS on the PS5 Pro? What the fuck are you doing? Oh, but the game's made to be played for the next 10 years. Yeah, go play GTA 5 on the PS3. It runs great. There is no excuse. Absolutely no excuse.
Final Fantasy VII, Metal Gear Solid, and countless other classics with just that tiny amount of memory. And yet, back in the mid-2010s, the modding community figured out how to push that to 8 megabytes, a massive upgrade that many thought was the absolute limit. But what if I told you someone just figured out how to push the PlayStation even further? So today, we're going to be taking the PlayStation from 2 megabytes all the way up to 16 megabytes of RAM. That's 8 times more than what Sony originally shipped the console with. So, let's take a look.
I like games that I can run MSAA on, make shit look sharp with less realism. Yeah, absolutely. I love emulators. Better than blurry 30 FPS shit. Yep.
Hey everyone, how's it going?
My name is What the fuck is that mic? I know what the arm is. This is, it's not the Amazon Basics mic. I think this is, either this is the, is it newer? Not new. I know this mic arm. I was going to buy the mic arm. I don't know what the fuck this mic is, though.
And welcome to another episode of Retro Renew. Now, one of the things I absolutely love about the modding community is that just when you think we've reached the limits of what these old consoles can do, someone comes along and proves us all wrong. So as we all know, increasing the RAM on retro consoles, like what we've done with others such as the original Xbox, is really a great way to give homebrew enthusiasts some breathing room to really push the hardware even further and experiment. More memory opens the doors to things like reduced loading times, using higher quality textures, building larger and more detailed 3D environments, and creating experiences that simply wouldn't fit within the original hardware's limitations. At the end of the day, RAM is often one of the biggest bottlenecks on these older systems. Remove that limitation, and suddenly developers have a ton more freedom to explore what's possible. While projects like the Super Mario 64 port certainly stand to benefit, this upgrade is about giving homebrew developers the freedom to create experiences that simply weren't practical on the stock PlayStation. So for over a decade, if you wanted to upgrade the console's memory, 8 megabytes was considered by most folks to be the absolute limit. Now, what's interesting is that Sony's original PlayStation development hardware, specifically the ISA and PCI cards, shipped with 8 megabytes of RAM.
It would do that because unoptimized builds, all this good stuff. You don't want your dev kit to die at the with your console with your entirely unoptimized game. Yeah, that makes sense. Also, there would have been other software running alongside the dev kit. You'd have your debugging tools and various other things that need to take up some of the RAM. So having the same amount as the actual hardware just was not feasible.
Once the community eventually discovered that, it inspired the original 8 megabyte RAM upgrade that has remained the, quote, standard for more than a decade. But earlier this year, a modder by the name of Tuner Tom decided to investigate.
Oh my god, that's really been well maintained.
Whether it was possible to build a PlayStation with 16 megabytes of RAM after he had a discussion with a fellow developer named Spicy JPEG on the PSX Dev Discord server. Looking specifically at Sony's arcade hardware and with the help of some very experienced software developers, Tuner Tom noticed something interesting. Those arcade boards sometimes featured 2 banks of 8 megabyte RAM chips, totaling 16 megabytes. And after tracing out how they were all wired up, he matched those up to the PS1, and well, he eventually managed to make a functioning 16 megabyte retail PlayStation. The PlayStation CPU was actually designed to address up to 16 megabytes of RAM. Sony just never took advantage of it in retail consoles.
So it's probably the same chip Is it labeled the same? Hold on. Does it see the label? You can't really see it, but it's probably the same chip from their arcade board.
16 megabyte retail.
Like if they had a working chip, they might as well just use it.
PlayStation. The PlayStation CPU was actually designed to address up to 16 megabytes of RAM. Sony just never took advantage of it in retail consoles. Now, because you clicked on this specific video, I'm sure you're all wondering what is actually needed to do this mod, and which PlayStation models does it work on? So those are great questions, and theoretically this upgrade can be done on any original PlayStation revision. But at least for now, the easiest model to work on is the SCPH 5500, which uses the PU18 motherboard. It comes equipped with 4 512 kilobyte RAM chips, giving the console its original total of 2 megabytes of memory. The nice thing is that those 4 chips...
When do we get PCIe FPGA cards with Mr. Course? We can get 100% hardware accurate... I assume someone's working on an FPGA PS1. Then you can download more RAM for your PlayStation.
Actually share the same exact footprint as the replacements we'll be installing, which come from this old 16 megabyte stick of EDO RAM right here.
Oh, wow.
You can see the chip model here if you want to find one for yourself, but a word of warning, these are actually getting a bit harder to find. But there's actually already a solution for that in the works, which we'll be coming back to later on.
Oh, somebody producing
now,
new
if you're
RAM.
paying close attention, you may have noticed that the memory stick actually has 8 RAM chips on it for a total of 16. The PlayStation motherboard only has
Wait,
room
does that
for
say
4
Kingston?
RAM chips on it.
It does. How long's Kingston been around for?
For a total of 16. The PlayStation motherboard only has room for 4. So how exactly are we supposed to fit all 8 2 megabyte chips onto the console? Well, very much like what we did on the Xbox RAM mod, we're going to be stacking them on top of each other. Now, it is a little more complicated than simply soldering one chip on top of the other, but I will show you exactly how it all works here in just a bit.
Okay.
So, we've got our replacement RAM chips and the PlayStation we're going to be modifying. The last thing we need is this little board right here. This is a quick solder board, or QSB. This one specifically was designed by another talented modder by the name of Hidden. The primary purpose of this is to reroute a few of the motherboard signals so the PlayStation can properly take advantage of all the extra memory. Now, you actually don't need this board. You can manually wire everything yourself, and Tuner Tom has an excellent written guide explaining exactly how to do that, which I'll have linked down below. But this QSB does make the installation significantly easier and leaves you with a much cleaner result.
Right.
Now, before we dive into the installation, I want to establish a baseline on the stock unmodified
I
PS1
love console homebrew's cool enough, but console modders, I think this is actually sick. And especially if people are doing it just for like, hey, how can we do some crazy homebrew shit? Not like, oh, I'm going to install a mod chip so I can play fucking cheats for my Call of Duty. No, like stuff like this is actually sick.
The extra RAM. To do that, a software engineer by the name of Spicy JPEG created this diagnostic suite for the PlayStation. I burned it onto a CD, and this will essentially allow us to verify the RAM that we have on the console. If you'd like to check that out for yourself, I'll leave a link to the GitHub down below. One quick note before we boot it up though, is that in order to run burn CDs like this, you will need to install a mod chip into your PS1. I installed the PSNI into the console, which I actually did in one of my live streams. I picked up this particular mod chip from Modsville, USA. Now, another thing to note is that installing a mod chip isn't required to do the RAM upgrade itself, but it is incredibly useful if you plan on running homebrew, or you can even opt to use something like an ODE, such as the ArcStation or the Xstation.
Oh, so you just load off of a SD card then? Huh. But I guess if you don't install the mod chip, why are you upgrading the RAM, right? Like, no games that you play are... Like, maybe something... No, like, no games are going to even... Yeah, because the games would be addressing the RAM to only 2 gigabytes. So, 2 megabytes. So, if you're not putting a mod chip, there's literally no reason to do this besides... I don't know, it's funny.
Anyway, with the software loaded, I'm going to go ahead and head into the all-in-one tester. Then over to the main RAM configuration menu. Right now, it's configured for the PlayStation stock 2 megabytes of RAM, so I'll go ahead and apply those settings, and then run the test. Now, it's actually also running the video RAM and sound RAM tests, but that's okay, we're just going to go ahead and run through everything. And there we go, everything passed with the system correctly detecting the 2 megabytes of RAM. Now let's try something a little different. I'm going to leave the bank size set to 2 megabytes, but increase the number of banks to 2. This is how Sony's arcade hardware is configured and effectively tells the software to look for 4 megabytes of RAM. I'll apply those settings and run just the RAM test this time. And as you can see, it immediately fails, which is exactly what we'd expect,
You haven't done it
because
yet.
this PlayStation only has 2 megabytes of RAM installed
right.
and not 4. So that's our baseline. Once the upgrade is installed, we're actually going to come back to this test and see if the console can recognize all 16 megabytes of RAM. And be sure to stick around to the end of the video because I also want to show you some of the possibilities that this extra RAM opens up. Now before I show you how to install this into the PS1, I do need to tell you about the sponsor of today's video, PCBWay.
Hey, we keep seeing these guys everywhere.
A new mod or want to assemble an open source
Yeah, this
project,
is a great sponsor.
PCBWay provides you with the tools to make them a reality. From 3D printing services in an array of materials, all the way to other services like CNC machining, injection molding, and of course PCB and flex ribbon fabrication. So when it comes to taking your retro mods to the next level, PCBWay is the place to make that happen. Check out the link in the description for PCBWay to get $5 off your first order. And again, a huge thank you to PCBWay
as always, great
for
sponsor.
sponsoring this video. Alright, so let's tear into the PS1. These consoles are pretty easy to open, so I won't bore you with the process. Once we get down to the motherboard...
Has anyone done like a cut down of the PS1 board? Because I know there's like a really smallest Wii cut board. Like you can cut the Wii board down to like basically fucking nothing. I don't know if anyone's done this with a PlayStation. I assume someone has. I don't know if anyone actually has done that.
First need to remove this RF shield, which is held in place by...
The funny COD clone, after a year, has not fixed me being able to put less than size equals 9,999 greater than in my username to make it take up the whole screen.
That's so fucking stupid. I showed you a GameCube mod that is the size of a CPU.
By several tabs soldered directly to the board. It's a little annoying, but simply melt the solder with your iron and then carefully work the tabs free. With the shield removed, we can now access the 4 RAM chips that need to come off. Normally I'd use hot air for this, but Tuner Tom actually recommends clipping the legs on one side of the chip and then gently rocking it back and forth to fatigue the legs on the opposite side until it breaks free. The reason for this is that applying too much heat to these boards can actually cause them to bubble up and delaminate, and that's definitely something you want to avoid. Once the chip is removed, desolder the remaining legs from the pads and then clean everything up with some desolder wick to prepare for our new RAM chips.
I've never soldered anything. Huh.
Then just rinse and repeat 3 more times. Now you do need to be careful if you're going to be using this method. I actually managed to lift off one of the pads, but fortunately it's a pretty straightforward repair, which I'll showcase later on. Okay, now let's go ahead and harvest the replacement chips from our stick of EDO RAM. For this, I will be using hot air, and thankfully these chips come off relatively easily. With all 8 of the chips removed, we can start installing them onto the PS1 motherboard. This part is also pretty straightforward. Just make sure each chip is installed in the correct orientation. I managed to get all 4 of the chips soldered down, but I still need to repair that lifted pad. To fix it, I simply used a thin piece of Kynar wire to connect the chip's pin to the corresponding via for the damaged pad. And just like that, we're back in business. It's obviously better if you don't have to do this, but it's certainly not the end of the world if you do. Okay, now it's time to stack the remaining 4 chips.
Yeah, again, this isn't something I've never even bothered to look at. Like, hardware hacking is something that I have basically no knowledge of.
On top of the ones we just installed. To do that, we first need to bend all the legs down until they're almost perpendicular to the chip. You'll want a nice flat surface for this, like a piece of glass, or in my case, the top of my PCB vise. This helps to ensure that all the legs are bent evenly at the same time.
Right.
Here's a close-up of what the finished legs should look like. It's not a dramatic bend, but you can definitely see the difference, especially when compared to the unbent legs on the other side. Now when bending the legs on the other side, you'll want to leave pin 7 standing upright. This is the bank select pin, which needs to remain isolated because we'll be wiring it up completely separately in just a moment.
Right.
Now we can place the chip directly on top of the original one, making sure it's oriented the same way and that all the pins line up with the legs below. The goal here is to solder each pin on the top chip to the corresponding pin on the bottom chip.
I love that this is just a thing you can do. That's fucking hilarious.
Effectively connecting the 2 RAM chips together. This is definitely one of the trickier parts of the mod, so definitely take your time. The most important thing is making
you don't want to bridge them, because then I'm sure it fucks something up.
Clean solder joints and avoid any bridges between adjacent pins. Once you're happy with your work, I highly recommend grabbing a multimeter and checking.
Check. Oh, yeah, sure. Okay, what is this? Oh. Yeah, that's clearly a bug. That shouldn't be able to happen.
For continuity. Place one probe on the pin of the top RAM chip and the other on the end of the corresponding pad on the motherboard.
Not sure if other players can see it, but they can see tags you put in the name. I see.
If you find any questionable connections, touch them up with your soldering iron and check for continuity again. And here you can see what the stacked RAM chips look like once they're fully installed. Notice again that pin 7 is lifted and isn't connected to the lower RAM chip. Now let's flip the board over and focus on this area here. This is where we'll be installing the QSB, but first we need to do a little prep work. We're going to need to solder to this via right here eventually, but it's actually covered by solder mask. So using my craft knife, I'm going to go ahead and scrape it away. Just below that area, we're going to need to cut this trace. For detailed photos showing these exact locations, I definitely recommend checking out Tuner Tom's written guide. Once this trace is cut, we're actually going to need to sever...
I guess they are just, like... I guess it's just like, yeah, again, hardware stuff is just not something I ever looked at. They're just like metal on the board, so you can just cut it. Yeah, of course.
3 more. They're all right next to each other, and I'm actually going to be marking them with a Sharpie first to make sure I don't accidentally cut the wrong traces. Then I carefully cut through each one using my craft knife. Okay, now we can finally install the QSB. After aligning it with the motherboard, I soldered all of the required points, which...
Also, busted my ass, my busted ass setup has not been nerfed. I can want to do every single play. What even is this game that you've been playing?
Which comes out to about 15 connections in total.
Combat Master, okay. Brolocks.
Great, everything's looking good so far. The next step is to solder a 22 ohm resistor into the designated location on the QSB. This is to match the lower RAM chips, which have an inline 22 ohm resistor on the RAS line.
Right.
Next, we're going to need to make a very small wire harness to connect pin 7 on all 4 of the RAM chips to the QSB on the back of the motherboard. I made mine by twisting 2 wires together, then another group of 3, giving me a total of 5 wires. One of those wires needs to be pretty long since it'll eventually be routed to the QSB on the opposite side of the motherboard. And here you can see me soldering the harness to pin 7 on each of the RAM chips.
Right. I assume if you bent off one of the pins accidentally, you're just fucking cooked. I don't think there's like a way to reattach it.
I then routed the longer wire through this hole here near the RAM chips before eventually soldering it to the pad labeled ROM on the QSB. And that's it. The 16 megabyte RAM upgrade is now complete.
Theoretically, if it works.
All that's left is putting the PlayStation back together. For the RF shield, I'm actually only going to be soldering in just a couple of the tabs to hold it in place. That should be more than enough to hold it securely, and it'll make removing it in the future, if needed, a lot easier. Then
surely there's got to be a hack to make it where you don't need to solder the RAM plate on and off constantly.
Soldering in just a couple of the tabs to hold it in place. That should be more than enough to hold it securely.
Like, with how much people are modding this console, there's got to be, like, some easier mod you can make to this. Maybe a couple way the chip resin to get access to the... Oh, see, okay, yeah. So if you cut into the chip, then you could fix it. Right, I see.
And it'll make removing it in the future, if needed, a lot easier. Then we can button up the rest of the console, and we're done. Well...
Fear of breaking the major reason I never got into hardware. Most of the time, software's an undo button, hardware doesn't. Most of the time, software does. There are cases where you can brick a device, sure, but they are fewer than what you have with hardware. Hardware, if you bridge a trace, and that trace is, I don't know, connected to some higher voltage power, you could just burn out the board.
Almost. Now let's find out if all that work actually paid off. We'll boot right back into the RAM tester, head over to the RAM configuration menu, and this time configure it for 2 banks of 8 megabytes each, giving us a total of 16 megabytes of system memory. Many arcade boards of this era actually had this RAM configuration.
Oh, okay.
I'll apply those settings, and now we'll run the RAM test. This one will take a little longer to complete. And there we go. We passed.
Okay.
That means all 16 megabytes of RAM is fully addressable and working exactly as it should. And just like that, we have a retail PlayStation with 16 megabytes of RAM.
I put your YouTube outro command into my computer, everything is gone. Don't delete the French. The French are very important. Port mem test PS1.
And at the time of making this video, this is only one of a couple in the world. Hopefully, after this video is released, the number starts growing because I'd love to see what the homebrew community does with all this extra memory. It really feels like the PlayStation modding scene is having a bit of a resurgence lately, between projects like the ArcStation that I covered a couple of weeks ago, and now this RAM upgrade. It's exciting to see people unlock new capabilities and hardware that's over 30 years old. Now, I can already hear some of you asking, this is cool and all, but did we break anything in the process? Well, for the most part, no. Retail games, for example, still work exactly as they always have. They don't know the extra memory is there, so they won't take advantage of it.
Yo, Kyler,
but
how
they
you
remain
doing?
mostly compatible. That said, because of the way some games access system RAM, there are a handful of titles that don't.
Let me guess. Do some games expect there to be 2 megabytes of RAM and then like intentionally wrap around at the end of the RAM or something fucking stupid like that?
Work with this mod.
Or do weird like bit flipping stuff?
In those cases, the game may crash or fail to boot altogether. For example, Final Fantasy IX wouldn't get past the PlayStation logo during my testing. So the even bigger question that I'm sure you're all thinking now is, what can we actually do with all this extra RAM? Well, 16 megabytes of RAM for the PS1 is still obviously very new. There really aren't any projects that fully utilize it just yet. Fortunately though, 8 megabyte support has been around for several years, giving us a good glimpse at the kinds of possibilities that additional RAM unlocks. One really interesting example is improving something called level of detail, or LOD. This is a trick that pretty much every 3D game uses, even modern ones. When an object is far enough away from the camera, the game will swap the detailed 3D model for a much simpler one with fewer polygons.
If your name is anything made in UE5, sometimes you do it a little bit too close to the camera. And there's ways to hide it, and some games do not use those ways.
Or triangles in the case of the PlayStation. Since those distant details are hard to see anyway, it saves both memory and processing power. A great example of this is in Gran Turismo 2. Here we're running a modified version of the game created by a talented software engineer named Silent. Because it has access to the additional RAM, it can keep the higher detail car models loaded at all times instead of swapping them out for lower detail versions.
I literally cannot tell. This right here is why I like to play on an emulator. Because you could tell me this is different, they look literally the same to me. Literally identical to me.
The higher detail car models loaded at all times instead of swapping them out for lower detail versions when they're far enough away. Now, I'll be honest, it's pretty difficult to spot the difference on a real PlayStation running at its native resolution over composite video. So to better illustrate what's actually happening, let's take a look at a similar comparison in an emulator which is running at a higher resolution. If you focus on the black Mitsubishi Evolution, you can clearly see the moment the stock game switches to the lower detail model, while the modified version continues to
Okay, now you're right, I see
render
it,
the
yes,
higher detail model the entire time. Now, this isn't the most dramatic example, but it does a good job of showing the kinds of things that additional memory makes possible. One interesting thing that I noticed is that the modded game appears to run ever so slightly slower than the stock version. As the replay footage progresses,
I would guess, again, because there's more RAM to address, and however the PlayStation is addressing that RAM, it takes a little bit more time to do so. That would be the only explanation there.
You can clearly see the two recordings gradually fall out of sync, with the 8 megabyte version lagging behind. My guess is that the console is working a little harder to render the higher detail models, but I can't say for certain what exactly is happening under the hood. Either way, it's an interesting observation that's worth pointing out. Another exciting possibility is making ambitious game ports much easier.
Or the RAM has slower timings? Actually, a good point. That's also possible.
Take the Super Mario 64 port for the PlayStation as an example. I do have a build that supports the additional RAM, but I wasn't able to get it fully working on my modded PS1. The project is still very much a work in progress, although it does run in an emulator on the PC, although even that still needs a bit of polish. I did have a chance to speak with the creator of the port, Malucart, who explained that having 16 megabytes of RAM would essentially eliminate about half of the challenge of bringing a game like this to the PlayStation. Instead of constantly worrying about memory optimization and dynamic loading assets, the entire game could simply be loaded into RAM all at once, just like many other ports already do. And that's what really makes this upgrade so exciting. Projects like that. It's about giving homebrew developers far more room to experiment and create things that simply weren't practical on a stock PlayStation. And there's one more possibility that has me especially excited: arcade ports. As I mentioned earlier, several
A N64 cartridge had 4 to 64 megabytes of memory. Average games were 4 to 16. So if a game was only took like 16 megabytes of memory, theoretically you could load the entire game in this context.
PlayStation-based arcade boards shipped with 16 megabytes of RAM. Since the hardware is already so similar, having a retail PlayStation with the same amount of system memory could make bringing some of those arcade titles onto the PS1 much more feasible. Now, some of those arcade boards also came with double the amount of video memory as well. While the retail PlayStation shipped with 1 megabyte of VRAM, certain arcade variants shipped with 2 megabytes. Which brings me to the next logical question: could we upgrade that too? Well, as it turns out, the answer is yes. Tuner Tom is already working on a VRAM expansion that will add an
So, I guess the end goal here is effectively turning a retail PlayStation 1 into arcade hardware. I guess that's where it's eventually going.
Additional megabyte of video memory, bringing the retail PlayStation one step closer to the higher spec hardware found in those PlayStation-based arcade systems. And if that wasn't ambitious enough, he's also developing an SPU RAM upgrade to expand the console's sound memory as well.
Wow.
So with all this news, it really feels like the future of PlayStation modding is just getting started, and I honestly can't wait to see what the community comes up with next. Now there is one small catch with all this that I did want to mention. These old EDO RAM sticks that we're harvesting these chips from are becoming harder and harder to find. Thankfully, there are already efforts underway by Tuner Tom to source compatible modern replacements.
Okay, it sounds like this Tuner Tom guy is the one who's like responsible for everything happening.
Thankfully, there are already efforts underway by Tuner Tom to source compatible modern replacement chips, which should make this mod much more accessible moving forward. So here we are, a PlayStation with 8 times the RAM it originally shipped with, and now only half as much memory as its younger brother, the PlayStation 2. Not bad for a console from 1994. Now, I gotta give a huge shout out to everyone who helped make this project possible, especially Tuner Tom for spearheading this project, Spicy JPEG for his incredible testing tools, Hidden with his fantastic PCBs, and everyone else over in the PSX development community. It's amazing to see so many talented people come together, still pushing this hardware in ways that have never been done before. It'd be an understatement to say that I am excited to see where this all goes next, because it feels like we're only scratching the surface of what these upgrades will make possible on the original PlayStation. But what do you all think? Is this a mod you consider doing on your PlayStation?
I don't have a PlayStation.
And what kinds of homebrew would you like to see take advantage of all this extra memory? Let me know down below in the comments. Now, if you enjoyed this video, I really think you'll like this one here, so check it out. And as always, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll catch you again next time.
It's crazy to hear that there are PS1s out there that are still fully functional, otherwise these people wouldn't have anything to mod. So a lot of people, they kept their PlayStation 1s and like actually kept them in a good state. But if you want a really high quality retro console, Japan has like a really crazy retro market. Like you can get effectively new hardware in Japan, and it's not crazy priced either, because people in the West don't want Japanese hardware for the most part, because then you got to do extra stuff, especially for the consoles that are region locked. I don't know if the PS1 was region locked, but some of the consoles were region locked. I think the NES was region locked. With a, I think it was the NES locked with a region locked with like a little plastic tab. But either way, there is still a lot of hardware out. It's getting harder to come by. It's getting more expensive, but there is still stuff out there. Also, I don't know about the PS1, but I know for like the NES and things like that, there are FPGA boards that do exist. Also, with a broken PS1, you can, like, depending on what's wrong, you can get it working again, because they're much simpler boards than even what you had with like the generation directly after that. That was a fun video. I like that. I need some lunch. I say lunch, it's 4 p.m., but, you know, close enough. So, if you're not seeing today's video on the 12 Worlds AI stuff, be sure to check that out. If you have, then you know it is what it is. I've got a fun video coming out on the weekend where I'm... You didn't even spell it correctly. Al Tung Tung Sasha. You want me to give some brain rot, and you're like, you don't even fucking spell it right. No, is that a different one? Look, maybe I don't know. Sahusha? Sasha? Al Tung Tung Sasha. There you go. Anyway, yes, as I was saying, what was I saying? Right, I've got a video coming out on the weekend, maybe the weekend, maybe Monday, I don't know, whenever it comes out, messing with a first gen Intel laptop. It has a FireWire port, it has a bunch of other shit, and I tried to install Linux on it, and well, it didn't go super well initially. So check that one out, that'll be out soon. Anyway, I'm gonna go, what's out today? What do we have? I know, I didn't see Yojo Senki yesterday. What is out today, though? Oh, the Gohan Slop is out. I'll watch the Gohan Slop. What else do we have? Koko wa ore. Slime isn't out till later. Otome Kaiju. Super no ura de. No, not Gohan. Gohans. This one. The funny camera angle. We have the camera angles in this trailer. We don't have the worst of the camera angles. Go watch it, it's fun. It's insanely over-animated because that's what Gohan's does. That's their shtick. Anyway, I'm gonna head out, so be good, be safe, and yeah. So enjoy your weekend. I'm gonna go. Have fun. Bye-bye.